Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals and what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earl. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsearl.com. In today's interview, I interview Victoria Secrist. Victoria specializes in working with people who have been impacted by suicide, whether they're experiencing thoughts and feelings related to suicide or have lost a loved one. Victoria uses a systems approach and encourages folks to connect with supportive persons in their lives who can help them navigate a rough terrain. As a military veteran herself, suicide prevention is a priority for her, and she works towards empowering people to find hope when life feels hopeless. Victoria is currently practicing in the beautiful state of Arizona after living in northern Colorado, and she is a proud dog mom, world traveler, and coffee enthusiast. So without further ado, here's my interview with Victoria. All right, Victoria, welcome to the Mind of a Therapist podcast. Thanks for taking some time to have an interview today. And so to get started, you've been doing private practice for a year now. Is that right?
Oh goodness, not quite. So I graduated from grad school with my degree in marriage and family therapy in August. So that's almost a year, but then I started working at a private practice in October. So we're getting there, but it's actually been about 6 months.
6 months.
Right now.
Okay, that's right. Approaching a year since you graduated and practicing 6 months. And so yeah, I'd love to hear a bit about, we've talked a little about it being quite a shift going from internship, and just in terms of client hours, but I'm curious to hear like what some key learnings have been for you as you've transitioned to private practice, what it's been like for you. Maybe start there.
Yeah, absolutely. So also just to give you a little bit of background, I before going into private practice, my internship was at a nonprofit, so community mental health agency. And I was also working there for 3 years before deciding to make that change to go into private practice. And I decided to start working for a group private practice so that I had more of that stability going into private practice, where it's not necessarily like me doing the marketing or having to have the space. So for me, that felt pretty supportive from the start. And I will say, like, starting in general, probably like regardless of where you go straight out of grad school, it's terrifying. And I had no idea what I was doing, even though, talking with others who had already graduated and what they were doing and hearing from professors, like, it still doesn't prepare you for your own experience and what that's going to be or what that's going to feel like. I also learned that a lot of people will start private practice by like working a side job and then go into it, because it takes time to build up that caseload to have those consistent clients. And as people know in private practice, if you're not with having that client hour, you're not getting paid. So all the extra work that you do, which is a lot of work, like I work a 40-hour work week, even if I see like 20 to 25 clients, just, with the amount of like paperwork or billing or, I don't know, extra stuff just pops up. Parents emailing me, parents wanting to talk to me. There is a lot that comes up. So I appreciate having that structure within the group practice. I built up a caseload fast, which is kind of terrifying at the same time. I think that'll probably be the theme of what I say is just like scary, fear, terrifying. But it only took me maybe 3 to 4 months to build up a caseload. And I think that's fast. I've been told that's fast. And so now I'm at this point of just trying to maintain where I'm at and having to listen to myself of like, what is going to be too much for me. So I've told you before, I'm at this like 20 to 25 clients a week. And for now, like I just have to try to get adjusted to that before adding any more people.
Yeah. And I'm curious, in the face of, you said terrifying and fearful to make this transition, what was important for you during that period, amidst that fear? How are you managed? How did you manage to continue to move forward in the face of
Mhm.
the fear of doing something n- very new in a lot of ways?
Mhm. So one thing that sparked for me is during this time of applying for jobs, because I was like, how do you find a private practice job? Like I went to Google, I went to Indeed, I went to LinkedIn, and I ended up applying for 3 different positions, and they were all different. One was like a W-2 position, one had a split that was like a 50-50 split, and the other one had like a 60-40 split. And so I was like, well, what am I supposed to do? These are all so different, like different structures, and they're all offering different things. And so looking back now, I wish I had consulted with more people who are already in private practice to gain an understanding of, hey, like, is this normal? Is this going to be sustainable? What are some things I should make sure that I get? What are, some tips, tricks that I should know? I feel like I didn't have that. And I feel like I've landed in an okay spot. But it just would have been nice to know, like, hey, make sure that supervision's included in that split, because that's a lot of money.
Sure, sure. Absolutely. So you were saying earlier that you've had a lot of parents contact you, and there's all these, paperwork admin hours that, have been a part of private practice. And have you mostly worked with younger people then? What sort of age range do you generally work with?
Yeah, so my age range is going to be primarily teens and adults. So right now I'm working just with individuals and couples, for the most part. I mean, working with kids, there's always going to be that family dynamic portion that just comes into the room that I get to work with. But those are kind of the populations that I'm working with the most right now.
Yeah. And I know you have some experience working with suicide, people with suicidal ideation. You had experience before your graduate studies, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So I was working at a nonprofit for 3 years, and within that time period, I came into this role as their like suicide prevention coordinator. So for them, I was figuring out, okay, how do we put some things in place clinically to prepare the therapists to work with suicide? How do we decrease the number of deaths that are occurring each year within the agency? So it's really like a systems level approach to, hey, how can we put in some buffers? How can we educate? How can we decrease the number of deaths that are occurring?
Yeah, and yeah, oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So, I feel like I probably brought this up in one of the classes we were in together. So pretty much like throughout my education, suicide was always something that I brought into the room. And I'm sure at some point people were like, oh my gosh, okay, we get we get that you love talking about this. But it was not in our curriculum. And it's something that's so important to talk about because it's going to come in the room, especially with just what the last year has been like. I mean, I had it coming in my room as an intern, and people were kind of concerned, I think, at first of giving those clients to me, but then they realized that I was actually more educated and prepared than some other people who had been there for a longer period of time or practicing for longer than me. Um, so it is something that I work with. It's something that you have to be very careful with in an outpatient setting. And I have learned that even more so while working in private practice, because it requires you to really do a thorough suicide risk assessment to know, okay, is this person at a place where they can be seen once a week and that's going to be supportive, or is a higher level of care needed?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've definitely echo that experience in grad school, and I've heard that from a lot of other graduate students, that there's just not enough education around suicide assessment. And
Mhm.
so well, maybe we could start with, some of our listeners are clinicians, some of our listeners
Mhm.
um, may have friends who have suicidal ideation, family members, maybe they themselves have suicidal ideations. Let's start with, you know, outside of speaking to clinicians, just your average person who
Mhm.
encounters somebody or is facing suicidal ideation themselves. What are some messages for that person? What are some resources, some messages that are really important for that person to know?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think when they have people within their communities, within their lives who are experiencing these thoughts, if they are fortunate to be able to find out, because a lot of times people are going to keep those thoughts to themselves. These thoughts can be terrifying, frightening. They don't know where it's coming from, what to do with them. So sometimes they will keep them to themselves. So if they do tell someone, I think it's important to also, specify like teens versus adults. Um, because if a teen goes and tells another teen, more than likely that person's not going to know how to respond. Um, and for teens, I really do recommend that they're able to express that to a trusted adult. It doesn't have to be your parent, but if there's like a teacher or a coach or, a community member who you're really close with, that you can share that information to, just so you can get the support that you need. But if we're, more so geared towards adults and talking to adults, really just being able to have an open mind, just listening to that person and what their experience is, not to cast judgment on them. My favorite word lately is validation. Being able to just kind of be empathetic towards them and just let them know, like, yeah, I hear you. That sounds really scary. I want to be here for you. I want to be able to support you. What do you need? Or, what are some things that we can do together to get you the support that you need? I also tell my clients that having suicidal thoughts is not necessarily an abnormal thing. Like, I think I love to throw stats out there, but I think right now it's like a third of Americans will experience suicidal thoughts at some point in their life. And especially this past year within 2020. We don't have the numbers yet for the number of deaths that by suicide that have occurred for 2020. In the United States, we've been at about like 45 to 48,000 per year deaths by suicide. And I expect that for 2020 and 2021 to be much higher, and much higher worldwide as well. So just being able to be open, being able to listen.
Mm.
Um, and I mean, as far as resources, there are suicide prevention hotlines. There are different crisis lines. I do have I have my screener right here. I keep it close to me. And so crisis lines, they are a great thing. It's great to have them available. It's great for people to be able to turn to them. And there's still a large number of people who won't, because it's the unknown, it's the fear of the unknown, what's going to happen. I have also had some clients who have reached out to the crisis lines, and not had the best experience before, or they felt like, well, they didn't tell me anything new. Like, we already have a safety plan. We already have distraction skills. We have coping skills. The safety plan really covers all of that and what to do in a crisis situation. I don't really know what to do, because that's all they really gave me. So I guess I say that with like a grain of salt. I think the lifelines can be life-saving, and they need to be there. And they're not always going to be what that person needs in the moment.
Mm. Yeah, and so I'm a family member or a friend of someone who's confiding in me these suicidal thoughts, and the best thing is then to take that empathic, validating, listening posture with them, and hold space for those ideas rather than going into a problem solving mode right away, or dismissing, or
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because then that is going to send the message of, is this person safe? Is this someone who I can continue confiding in? Is this someone who can be helpful? But it's also important to know, if you are a friend or family member of someone who, and they are expressing these thoughts to you, it's important to know how far along those thoughts are. Most people at some point will have these thoughts of like, you know, life's hard. It'd be easier if I didn't wake up, or, people are better without me being here. And that is what I refer to as passive suicidal ideation. So it's not the person saying, I'm going to kill myself. It's not them saying, I'm going to like go in my car and run into a truck. So that is much different than if someone is saying like, yeah, I wish I weren't here anymore.
Sure. So getting a sense of having some curiosity about, well, like, what are
Mm-hmm.
these, how do these thoughts show up? What do they look like? What's the content? And if it's more of that passive, I don't really want to be around today, versus I, have been seriously thinking about killing myself with this gun.
Mm-hmm.
Those are two very different
Yes.
scenarios.
Yes, absolutely. Because if someone expresses to you that they have intent to kill themselves, they have a plan, and they have the means to kill themselves, like that's when you need to intervene right away, with a higher level of care. So lots of areas will have local crisis support. Um, so it really, I know that you're in Colorado right now. I'm in Arizona, so that looks different for our states. Um, but so it could be reaching out to one of those like crisis response services, or it might just be a matter of we need to take you to the hospital right now. Um, so when you have, like I said, the intent, the plan, the means, and even like a time or date to carry it out, yeah, that's when my like big red flags are going off, and it's like, okay, that's when you need to like call 911, or you need to get to a hospital.
Sure. And so plan and means, those seem relatively straightforward to have some curiosity about. How do you assess for intent? What are some questions you ask? What are you wanting to get to know there?
So I think intent kind of falls in line with desire. And so just hearing more about, what is occurring in that person's life that makes them want to die to get to that point. So, common things that you're going to hear are feeling like a burden. So the person feels isolated, they feel like they're alone, they feel like they have a lack of support. And any little sense of like reaching out to someone that is telling them, I have a problem, I'm a burden. What I hear a lot too is like, I don't deserve this, I'm not worthy. So there is really a sense too of just being at times maybe like defeated. And I really can see the despair at times in some of my clients, just really to feel that pain that they are going through. So I think that's an important thing to say too, is that, I think this is still like a myth and a misconception within our society, is that, when someone does die by suicide, it is to end the pain. Life is too painful. They cannot see outside of that. It's almost like you have this tunnel vision going on, because you're experiencing such an intense emotional response that there is no reason or logic in that moment. And the way to end the experience is to die.
Yeah, so it's in general, it's just so much pain for people that that is the motive. I just can't bear this pain anymore. So I that
Mm-hmm.
this is the solution.
Absolutely. And right now, suicide is the second leading cause of death for adolescents. And, for during that development stage, I mean, our brains are not fully developed until 25 now. That's the latest research on, and maybe people have known that for a while. So knowing that they're teens already, are going to have an added level of impulsivity because they're still developing, they're growing.
Sure.
And so that is what can make suicide so scary and dangerous within that age range, because your world, I mean, think back to when you were a teen. Like, your worldview is small. You know your family, you know your school, and you know whatever communities you're a part of. And I mean, when I think back to being a teen, like, if I was experiencing those thoughts, like, I wouldn't know what to do. Or if I had something occur that was so devastating that I felt like my life had ended or was ruined, I don't know what I would have done.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's your sense of the factors that keep people from talking about suicide with others? Because I know that problems
Mm-hmm.
generally grow in isolation. And what are these maybe societal, familial um, forces that might keep someone from reaching out for help?
Yeah. So I really like that question. So the first thing that comes to my mind is having this sense of checking in with yourself of, okay, what does suicide mean to me? Where have I learned this? Where have I seen it in my life? How have I seen it portrayed within the media? So the one thing that, well, it's not one thing, but one thing that's kind of frustrating is still hearing people use the word, even in our media, commit suicide. This is language we are trying to get away from. This is language that is stigmatizing suicide. Um, and so, being able to get away from that language, I think, is important, to be able to say, like, someone died by suicide or someone killed himself.
Yeah.
Like, some people don't like that explicit term, but if we don't talk about what's really happening, how can we destigmatize this, and how can we actually have productive conversations about it in the wider society, within our media? Um, when there have been suicide deaths in the last few years, I see it all over the news. So and so committed suicide, and I just can't believe that we're still using this language.
Yeah, I read Thomas Joyner's book, Why People Die by
Mm-hmm.
Suicide, and I think he mentioned that suicide was a crime in a few states at
Mm-hmm.
one point in history, and it's just wild to think,
Yep.
yeah, that word committing, it's linked with
Mm-hmm.
a a crime,
A
criminal
crime.
activity, and so
Yes.
obviously that has a tremendous effect on people who are having these thoughts. Oh, this is associated
Mm-hmm.
with criminality. uh,
Exactly. And I mean, that's the language we use of, like, so and so committed a crime. They committed a felony. I mean, that's ingrained language that we use when it does come to crime, and suicide is not a crime. Um, I love that you brought up Dr. Joyner. I love his work. He's definitely, a leading pioneer within the field of suicidology. Um, so I'm glad that you brought that up. Um, I had in my mind what I wanted to say, and now I'm trying to bring it back
Happens to
up.
me all the time. One other thought I had as you were talking there that I wanted to share was I was listening to a podcast recently, and I'm totally forgetting what podcast it was or who was speaking, but they were talking about mental health stigma, and
Mm-hmm.
when someone breaks their arm, right, or has diabetes, a heart issue, it's there's not a lot of shame surrounding talking about that issue, but when someone's dealing
Mm-hmm.
with depression or anxiety or shame, suicidal thoughts, it's just different. People don't talk about, there's just so much more shame there, and I thought that was just an interesting comparison that I wanted
Mm-hmm.
to mention, because it's important for us to recognize this and then say, well, depression, anxiety are very common. Everyone experiences them on some
Mm-hmm.
level, and then suicidal thoughts, as you were saying, about a third of people. So these aren't uncommon phenomena, but they're so stigmatized in our society that there's not that much space to talk about them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you actually activated that thought I had. you know, coming into the space of having our own experiences and perspectives, some people are going to believe possibly even that suicide is a sin, that it goes against their religious beliefs. So I think that can also be a division within our society, or reasons why people don't feel comfortable talking about it. I mean, even for a long time, like when I heard, and I think this maybe happens for people still, when I heard the word suicide for the first time, like I was 5 years old, and it felt like this really scary word. Like it didn't feel good. And I heard this word because I had a family member who had died by suicide. And I didn't even know what that, I mean, that wasn't explained to me at 5 what that meant. I didn't know. And no one was going to explain it to me. It was one of these things that we could just kind of sweep under the rug. We're not going to talk about. And so it's taken time to really, even for myself to get an understanding of what does this word mean to me? What does this mean in general? And how can we work with it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so you talked about around assessment, when someone is contending with suicidal thoughts, you're looking for a plan, you're looking for means to execute that plan, and then the intent. Are there, what other pieces would you mention to our listeners around suicide assessment that are really important for people to have on their radar?
Yeah. So the things you mentioned, you can also kind of think of that as just kind of like a quick screen for suicide. So this thing that I had shown before, this is the short version of the CSSRS, which is the Columbia, oh gosh, people call it the Columbia for short, but it's like suicide severity rating scale is what it stands for. And this is the short version of it, which is essentially what I went over before. And it has, you can see, where do I point? The different colors to then show, okay, this needs to bring up a red flag for you. So when you dive into a suicide risk assessment, which is going to be done by a professional, there are a few books that I have that I really love that have helped me through this process. But also I am trained in CAMS, which is the collaborative assessment and management of suicidality. And that's kind of my go-to for the suicide risk assessment. Because it's nice to be able to have something in front of me. So I'm not just relying on my memory. But things that we'll go over is, learning about these thoughts that people are having, learning the frequency of the thoughts, the duration of the thoughts, the intensity of the thoughts, learning of other potential risk factors. Are there relationship issues? Are there any other mental health concerns going on? Are there any legal troubles, substance abuse troubles, impulsivity? So you're really trying to gain a wider picture of this person, their life, their experiences, and additional risk factors that could be contributing to their experience in the moment. And, the field of suicide and suicidology, like it's complex. Like it's not easy. No one person is going to be experiencing these thoughts or feelings in the same way or for the same reasons. And that gets tricky because with suicide, like you have certain mental health disorders that are what I consider to be the more serious. Of course, there's going to be different severities that people experience those disorders as well. And then, there are certain traumatic situations that could possibly increase the risk that someone would have a suicide attempt in their life. So when you really start talking about it and diving into the research and the literature, it can feel overwhelming because there's so many possibilities for why someone would attempt.
That's certainly been my experience as a therapist in training. As I've looked into the literature, I've had that template of the quick screen as you were talking about, but then there's so much more information out there, and I've really been craving some structure, a template for what I might run through. And so you mentioned a few books and that
Yep.
CAMS. What would be a good place for me or for any of our listeners who are wanting a bit more
hmm
structure and support in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is CAMS. So I have the book, but if you just Google CAMS, it will pop right up. It is a one or no, it's 3 hour training. And it goes over what this is. It gives you the forms, PDF version. They also now have the PDF fillable forms, which is nice. Um, I appreciate having this to lean on. I appreciate having this for support. It is a framework, it is not a model. So you can implement, it's not going to change your therapeutic style. It's just going to support you in learning how to work with suicide at the lowest level possible before you decide, um, that maybe an inpatient or IOP is necessary. So this is definitely a go-to for me, has given me a lot of support. And they have all sorts of different trainings on their website too. And after you do the training, they offer consultation calls, and there's also an in-person training that you can go through. So I really do recommend this. One of my favorite books is collaboration between Dr. Joyner and some other researchers, where they did the work on the interpersonal theory of suicide, and they have a book called I don't have it here with me right now, but I believe it is Working with the Suicidal Client. And that book is great because it references to that theory, which just kind of dives further into why people attempt suicide and how they get to that point and what are some of those factors. So if you really like to nerd out on research, that is going to be a great book. But I feel like Dr. Joyner also comes from this narrative perspective, which I appreciate a lot, and just his metaphoric language that can make it easier to digest. Another, do I have it here? Yeah. So The Practical Art of Suicide Assessment is written by Jean Christopher Shea, and he created the case approach. And so that's just another great resource to find a way that's going to work for you to kind of make your own of how to approach suicide assessment. And so that's just another way to do it. There's all sorts of ways to do it. And of course, people are like, try out this way. This way is maybe the best way. But I like to kind of take a little bit of everything and apply that to my approach, so I don't miss anything, or try not to miss anything.
That's good. Well, we're getting to the end of the interview, and before I have a question that I always end with. Before that question, is there anything else that you wanted to mention today? Anything that popped to mind that you'd like to share before we start to wrap up?
Yeah, so I can also provide you just with like a list of my favorite resources that I give to clients and parents. But one book I do want to go over real quick. I leave this in the, not that you can see it, but it's called Robbie's Hope. And it's actually based out of Colorado, an organization. And this family created this organization after their son died by suicide. And so this is an adult handbook that they created that they had teens help them write. And it's how parents and just really adults can approach teens about mental health. So it kind of goes over mental health in general, but it does go over kind of signs when you do need to have, extra support and professional help for your teen. I also like to give this to my teens though, just so they can kind of check in with themselves, and just to give them more support if they did have a friend reach out to them who needed help.
Oh, that's really good. Yeah.
And these are free.
Oh,
So they're on the Robbie's Hope website. You can download the PDF in English and in Spanish. And if you want the actual books, they're free. You just pay for shipping. And it's my go-to resource for parents and teens.
Oh, that's great. And I'll put all those books that you just mentioned in the show notes so people have a link to them. And in closing here, the question I always pose at the end is what's a message of hope that you'd like to leave the listeners with?
Message of hope. So behind me, I actually have a hope wall. And so I have my clients, if they have a message of hope they want to leave, or they can see when they come into my office. So that's a really, really great question. I think my message of hope would be, even in the darkest of times, it is still possible for there to be a light to get through a challenging time. And, one thing that I tell my clients is like, maybe you don't have the hope right now, but I'll hold that hope for you and keep reminding you of that when you come in here. Because I just really am a firm believer that even in the darkest of times, you can still walk through. You can still make it through. You might feel like you're walking through fiery pits, but life is not always going to feel this way. It is possible for things to change. That's one thing that we can count on, is change within our life, whether we deem that as a good or a bad thing, however you want to take it. But I would just really strongly encourage people to not lose faith, to not lose that hope that things can change.
That's good. Yeah, I love that message of the one consistent thing in life is change. It's just, that's no disputing that. Well, Victoria, thanks so much for being on the podcast today. If people want to get in touch with you, where would be the best place to direct them?
Yeah, so my name is Victoria Secrist, and you can find me on Facebook. So my handle is going to be at Victoria, the MFT. And I'm also on Psychology Today, where people can find out more information, but really Facebook's probably the best place to go.
Perfect. Well, thanks again for taking the time, Victoria.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.